Ronnie, Simon, thank you so much for joining me today. We've been talking about getting together for a while on camera, and I'm just delighted that we're all here today. Wonderful to see you.
Hi, Louise.
Ditto from me. Louise, I would say that, yes, this is the first time we've been speaking about getting together on camera with others, but the three of us have enjoyed what for me is without a doubt my favorite Zoom relationship for a very long time. We've been graced to know you, to learn from you, and it's a pleasure to be here in a different capacity today. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ronnie. That's really awesome to hear. So I think one of the reasons for getting on camera and having this conversation between us is the discussion around mental health and the knock-on effect of the pandemic in terms of not only today, what we're experiencing today, but what we foresee for the future. And I really wanted to get your take on this because last year, we talked a lot during the course of the year around resilience, building resilience. And, you know, we're almost a year in globally. And I'm sure you've witnessed this, I've witnessed this, that what we've experienced is incredible resilience from people. And yet the knock-on effects in terms of mental health may well be far-reaching. And I'd love to get your perspective on this.
There are so many ways to respond to this. There is the hard data. So in the United States, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, reports that 1 out of 3 Americans are experiencing either significant, and this is by self-report, significant anxiety or depression relative to 1 in 10 at the same time last year. That's a number. It doesn't mean much. Well, pardon me, it means a lot. And we can discuss the reasons for that in a bit. But I will share with you this morning that I didn't follow one of my rules, which is sort of a daily experience, and that is not to check one's email first thing in the morning. But I made the mistake of doing so, and thinking about this discussion, and these are 2 of the headlines that I noticed just at random this morning, opening up my email. So from Maria Shriver, an article, Facing the Grief Gathering in Our Hearts, talking about the notion of grief as an experience that has not been much expressed, excuse me. Then I read Therapy for the End of the World. That's sort of a headline grabber. And that was a fascinating article talking about the anxiety about climate crisis, which is spreading like wildfire, and the mental health implications and understanding of that. It is now in the American Psychological Association considered a disorder. I will share with you my own story from this weekend, only because I think it's such a typical one in that the wild shifting of intense feelings over brief periods of time, I think is something that almost everyone can relate to. I was blessed with the opportunity to receive a second vaccination of the Moderna vaccine, and it was an ordeal. The vaccine was administered in a inner city public hospital in a building that was erected in 1831. And honestly, Louise, I don't think it had been repainted in all that time. And it was chaotic, and there were long, long, long lines. And as one is experiencing the frustration of that and the confusion, and there's, nobody is in charge, and concern for others who were, who were elderly or infirmed, no chairs, no place, just lines, not moving. But at the same time, one felt those kinds of immediate frustrations, had to ground oneself. This is fabulous. I'm so excited. I'm so fortunate. As I said, I'm blessed. Had the vaccine, elation. Appreciating all the caveats about needing to maintain vigilance, et cetera, et cetera. But briefly, absolute elation. Get home. Am awaiting what I've read a great deal about in terms of the anticipated side effects, which can run from minor to moderate, typically, with these vaccinations, and especially for a second vaccine. Nada, Louise, nothing. I experienced nothing. So the obsessional thinking begins. No fever, no chills, no soreness, nothing. Is my immune system deficient? Am I not mounting a response? Am I therefore not going to be protected when I am confronted with the virus? I check on maybe I received a bad lot of vaccine. So I check on the Moderna website, the lot number that was written on a little piece of paper for me by the administrator of the med. Error message from Moderna. No such lot number exists. Holy. So I checked the lot number of the first vaccine that I received, where I did get some local soreness. That has 8 numbers. The current lot number for the second vaccine has 7. Obviously, someone did not, they're all going to be the same. So this one also, error message, no such vaccine exists. So I went from elation to worry to fear to a real sense of helplessness. There's nobody to talk to. If one tries to, I did this as a private citizen and was fortunate enough to find I looked online, New Yorkers, people in New York City were being directed to Buffalo, New York, which is about 400 miles away for a vaccination. There's nobody to talk to. What can you do? And so then a kind of resignation, depression. I mean, the whole, the cycling through so many events. And in the end, I think probably the most prominent is the sense of, where is my agency? What can I do? So I think that's representative, not necessarily around the issue of getting the vaccine. And I hope for others that it's not the case, that they all do get a little sick, and that it will disappear gracefully and quickly. But I think it's a reminder about what we're all struggling with the sort of the never-ending, repetitive weirdness of time.
Yeah, it's such an extraordinary time. Sometimes I'm just hit by the weight of living through such an extraordinary time, and the fact that we're all going through it together, although, as we've heard over the last year, we might be in the same storm, but we're in very different boats, depending on where we are and how governments are able to mobilize and work with all of this. And this morning, I too was also reading up a little bit about mental health, knowing that I was going to have this chat with you. And I saw a couple of articles around some research that's been continuous over the last year, and how the actual anxiety around the virus itself doesn't seem to be too bad, but anxiety to do with the economic ramifications of what we're all going through, and the fact that there doesn't seem to be an end to anything. And I guess, Ronnie, you would know this far better than I do, but not knowing what the outcome will be and not having an end date is incredibly stressful for most people, to whatever they're facing. Simon, I'd love to just turn to you for a moment, because you wonderfully represent young people for us today and, day to day. And I'd love to hear from you, the mental health side of your experience with people in your age group and the experience that they're having at the moment.
Certainly, Louise. It's a strange situation to be in for all of us. I think your point about the virus is affecting all aspects of our ecosystem, and the ecosystem itself has undergone a huge amount of transformation and change. I mean, the pandemic is one thing. Here in the States, there have been tumultuous group protests and economic instability, a contested election. And these are all factors that just contribute to a general sense of overwhelming anxiety. This is also, my first US election. So as an Australian living here, this is a completely uncharted territory to navigate. Ronnie's point about grief is an interesting one too, because I think that grief is a very patient emotion. So if you're not dealing with it now, it's going to come up later on when it either just bubbles to the surface and it forces itself to be dealt with, or you choose to deal with it in a way that's constructive and work through the feelings of loss and the feelings of sadness and heightened anxiety. But there are tools out there and there are strategies. And what I think is great is that this is a collective experience. We don't have to deal with this on our own. So I think in a really beautiful way, it's bringing a lot of people together in new ways that perhaps they wouldn't have done before.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, excuse me. I was just going to say, responding to what Simon did and your question to him, that the experience of something on the level, at the level of our mental health is universal. If we think about mental health as a kind of continuum from those who are fortunate to be optimally resilient to those of us who have occasional sustained systems of distress, to those with more prolonged periods of distress, towards the other end of the continuum, those with frank psychiatric disorders. Everybody is experiencing a shift. That is universal. Not everyone is aware of it, perhaps, but if we understand how our bodies function at a cellular level, there is no one who is immune to the impact of chronic stress. So you are moved a little bit or a lot. You're more vulnerable if you're already impaired and dealing with a diagnosed or a diagnosable psychiatric illness, but we're all affected. So whether one be young and vital as Simon or me, at a different life stage, we're all impacted. And how we think about it, what we do about it, those are choices that we do have.
And that, I guess, is the key here, isn't it, Ronnie? And the fact that there are choices that we do have. And you mentioned earlier, Simon, there are certain strategies and things that we can employ to actually assist us. So you run a Genome Advisory, and I always think of you as the bridge between science and ordinary people like me, you know, people who perhaps don't have that that background or deep understanding or insight into what's going on in the advancement of science and the application for ordinary everyday people. And I know one of the key ways of us actually having some agency over how we respond to this stress that we're all facing to some degree is down to epigenetics. And what I would love for you to do, rather than me bumbling my way through what is epigenetics, tell us what epigenetics is and why it's so important.
Well, I propose that Simon and I do this as a team because we are such a pretty powerful team. An interesting word, epigenetics. Epi comes from the Latin meaning above. So epigenetics is a system above our genes. Let me just briefly remind everyone what they knew probably in high school. You know, what is a gene? A gene is a basic building block of our body. The gene contains all of our DNA, and that's the material that is inherited through generations and responsible for many traits and states and health and disease. So epigenetics is the system that controls the expression of our genes. So it literally turns our genes on and off. And our explosively accelerating understanding of epigenetics is great news, and ultimately it eliminates that sense of genes as absolute destiny. Genes are a contributing factor to the quality of our lives and how we develop, but in the end, it really is this: genes are fixed. We inherit them. For the most part, they don't change. Our epigenome, which is the collection of all of these epigenetic factors, constantly shifting, completely dynamic, and very much affected by so many factors. What we eat, how we sleep, how we move, how much we move, our mental health, our mindfulness. The list goes on and on and on. Simon, I'm going to...
What Ronnie's describing here is really an interaction of our genes with the environment. And what's really nice about that concept is that we're referring to both external and internal environments. So negative environmental factors will put our genes at risk, and then positive environmental factors will promote cellular resilience. So one can think of this epigenome as sort of a risk resilience switch. And that dichotomy presents itself every day in very familiar ways. So toxic versus organic, exhaustion versus rest, self-defeating versus self-care, the list goes on. And what's really nice about epigenetics as a concept, as we're working with clients, is that it offers a framework to inform and guide decision-making. So if we start to think of, say, Ronnie mentioned diet, if we started to think of food not only as fuel, but as information that's feeding our cells, that could be a really positive driver to make good decisions in times of weakness, or just providing new context to to
Or
what we're putting in our
vulnerability, like
bodies.
last year, which we're all
So and to tie into the conversation that we're having about the last year, a lot of people have been eating worse, have been drinking more. So these have epigenetic influences on the expression of your genes. So this framework is very useful, and people are very responsive to it.
A very helpful analogy for me between our genes and the epigenome is the notion of a theatrical script. So Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. Those are fixed words he penned. And if one has ever seen the film of Laurence Olivier back in the 40s perform Hamlet, his Hamlet is an utterly different character from the Hamlet of Jude Law or a Benedict Cumberbatch. I know that because I'm a Cumberbitcher. And these, so Shakespeare's script is like the DNA, and the expression of that script by these various characters using the same DNA produces a completely different character. And it's a very helpful way to think about how dynamic this interaction is.
And it's so super encouraging, because had I thought of epigenetics, my lifestyle, my thoughts, my feelings, and my behavior as actually being the script to my overall well-being, and I might have viewed this whole thing slightly differently, because of course we hear through the health industry and endless self-help stuff that what we eat and how much we sleep and all of these factors affect us enormously. But to actually hear about it in this context, explained in this way, makes me feel that I have so much more agency over my life day to day, just to be in that optimal state of health. So I think there's a lot of confusion around, and you've just stated it so clearly, Ronnie and Simon, around the vaccination, the various different vaccines, and how they might be changing our DNA. And I always jokingly say, and I'm hoping that I'm saying the right thing, that one would need CRISPR to change genes, actual genetics. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm going to say that's correct enough for a reasonable conversation. Yes. And there have been some extraordinary advances, and CRISPR will be the definitive treatment for. There are some genes that are fully penetrant, and there's no amount of meditating, mindfulness, proper nutrition, et cetera, which will prevent the expression of those genes. But they are really a tremendous minority. And then there will be some mutation of genes in one's lifetime. But even those, in the end, in terms of the development of poor health, are a minority. It's the epigenomes. It's genes turning on, genes turning off. And again, in this time when there are so many forces that really we can't control. We can only control, to some degree, our response to them. This way of understanding our health and future health and longevity affords real agency. And that is an epigenomic, that creates a positive epigenomic environment as well. We talked about mental health. The worst thing, as I described my weekend and my fears now about whether I was vaccinated or properly vaccinated or whatever, is the sense of a lack of agency. So what can I do? And doing doesn't necessarily mean fixing. Sometimes doing just means, and Simon alluded to this, just means feeling, allowing oneself to feel, but having the agency over that. It's okay. Yes, I checked my email too quickly this morning, but the self-judgment, the self-criticism, that's up to us to moderate. Okay, I was doing the best that I could. I was curious about some potential incoming mail. So what? It gave me some information I could share with Louise.
There's one example that I'd like to share, Ronnie. You might be mad at me for sharing this, but there is one example that we joke about frequently, which is, you imagine, you know it's coming up. So you imagine that you're sitting in a kitchen and you have to choose between blueberries or a scone. And going back to the concept that food is not just fuel, it's also information, how does that guide your decision making? Do I eat the blueberries or do I eat the scone? Now, if 6 out of 7 days of the week you eat the blueberries, but 1 out of 7 you eat the scone, I think there's also a mindset that needs to be, I'm allowed to eat this today and I'm going to feel good about it. And not to beat yourself up about giving yourself a treat, because we deserve treats. We deserve to not be harsh on ourselves for taking rewards. And I think that, that mindset is a really important internal environmental factor that we need to get under control. Yeah.
But it's important to understand that beyond one's genes, perhaps I meant the blue kind that one wears on one's bottom half, our trousers may not fit as well as we like if we make the scone decision 6 days out of 7. That's one way of thinking about the consequences. It's another to go through the literature and look at the extraordinary data that's been generated about which genes are being affected by which choices. We're at the early stages of being able to use food absolutely prescriptively. These genes are this is what you should avoid on the basis of your genetic profile. This is what you should, but there is certainly general information. In one very, very large study in California that looked at in patients who were being treated for cardiac disease, who came into this study with high cholesterol, and these patients were not given medication. They were prescribed primarily a plant-based diet, movement, exercise, and significant exposure to mindfulness and meditation. There were 500 genes whose expression changed over the course of 3 months, and genes that are responsible for the biologic processes related to aging. So telomeres, and oxidative stress, et cetera. Anthony Fauci, who is certainly a household word, in the United States, and so greatly esteemed for his clear words and his leadership during the pandemic, once made the very astute comment You can't rush the science, but when the science begins to point you in the right direction, you can start rushing. So the science is pointing us in the right direction, and that makes this field so exciting.
But what's really exciting for me, observing this as well, is that it's informing a lot of the practices that have always been there, or at least been developed over the last 100 years, and it's giving them credibility. For instance, Eric Kandel back in, I think it was the 80s, Ronnie, described psychotherapy as a form of epigenetic intervention. So again, this is a new way to think about an established practice, and it gives it scientific validity in a new way, which is really exciting.
I would just add to Simon's description of Eric Kandel. He is a Nobel Prize winner in his 90s now, who was trained as a classical psychoanalyst. He's a physician, and who won the Nobel Prize in medicine for his bench research on memory in sea urchins. He's just a brilliant scientist, but he got it way back then when epigenetics was barely in the vocabulary. And one could take extend Simon's example even way further back. When you look at practices like mindfulness and meditation that have been with us for so long, or shamanism, which encourages us to be in touch with nature, to now look at the scientific understanding of the impact on a cellular level of these kinds of practices actually just reminded me, and if you bear with me while I flip a little paper, because I know I have this close by. I'm going to read you an email signature of a very favorite physician friend of mine. And he writes, after he signs his email, and this is a quote: "Live in rooms full of light. Avoid heavy food. Be moderate in drinking of wine. Take massage, baths, exercise, and gymnastics. Fight insomnia with gentle rocking or the sound of running water. Change surroundings and take long journeys. Strictly avoid frightening ideas, would that we could. Indulge in cheerful conversation and amusements. Listen to music." This is an epigenetics prescription 2,000 years old from a Roman encyclopedist, Aulus Celsus. That's epigenetics. So, and grandma, our benevolent grandmothers who told us to eat our spinach, were also practicing epigenetics, geneticists, excuse me. And as Simon said, it's so exciting to see the science developing behind this common wisdom. And we look at the science as a multiplier, another lens through which we can look at, in some ways, some of this is common sense, but it is leading us on a path to, it is the path to precision medicine, to personalized medicine, so that in a very short period of time, and I am most mindful myself that some commercial applications have kind of jumped the gun a little bit, and they're making promises that they shouldn't be making today, but that we can be looking forward to tomorrow, so that with some saliva, with a small blood sample, we will be able to prescribe a diet. We will be able to tell you which supplements you may need, which you should avoid, what kind of exercise is the best, at what intensity, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a very exciting notion too. The only thing I want to add to this, which we haven't touched on, which is the most exciting of all, there is something called a biologic clock, which allows us to determine the biologic age of our cells. So our biologic age the biologic age of our cells is reflected in a excuse me, in a personal biologic age, and that is really the functional age of our bodies. Our chronologic age is our age. If you just celebrated your 30th birthday, you're 30 years old, but your biologic age and your biologic clock may be 25 years old or 35 years old. And how we live and how we treat our genes, if you will, how we express them through our epigenetic choices affects our biologic clock, and we can slow our rate of aging. And there's just tremendous research being done in this area. So if we determine our biologic age at one point in time, we can retest and see that the aging process is slowed down, and the implications for healthy longevity, a greater health span, not just a longer lifespan.
Yeah, I think this is quality, isn't it? That really, really matters. Yeah. Sorry, Simon.
And no, not at all. This is one of Ronnie's superpowers as well. It's her ability to assess what is possible today and make recommendations based on science, and also filter out a lot of the snake oil salesmen in this space. A lot of people are making promises to vulnerable populations that want to live longer and live healthier, and frankly can charge a lot and rip people off. But there's also, it's good to know where the science is today and what it's capable of, but also what it'll be capable of tomorrow. And all individuals and families should have a purview on what that is, so that they can make informed choices that affect their health and legacy.
Yeah, and what I would love for you to do is to just take us through how you might work with a client, because I think this, as a physician, as a psychiatrist, Ronnie, obviously that care and working with people in a pretty straight up way. As you say, Simon, not promising things that science is not yet capable of. I've just got to go back to what you said a minute earlier as well, Ronnie. The beautiful thing I'm loving about science today is that all of the age-old wisdoms that we know to be true are being proven, as you said, bit by bit. And this idea of actually having some agency over how our genes switch on, switch off, what the impact might be within our families. Perhaps there are hereditary factors that one would need to take into consideration. So perhaps if we take all of that and all of this beautiful knowledge that you've shared with us, and just take me through how you might work with a client, a family, let's say, for example, from starting today and then working with the science going forward.
Well, one, I start with the basics, and what is essential in the end is a relationship, developing a relationship in which people can feel free and comfortable to reveal who they are, what their life experiences have been, and what their concerns are. So I get to know people in a very sort of, how do I say it, old-fashioned, high-touch sort of way. There's not a questionnaire that will, the questionnaire will give you some data, but it doesn't allow you to know someone. One's health history is very important, and one's psyche, as Simon was describing earlier on, is the sort of internal environment, if you will, that is rarely considered when we think about genes. As an example, talking to a kind of distant friend, someone I don't know well, about the kind of work that I was doing in this, and how it is being affected by current events, if you will. He said, well, you know, he sort of got it, but he didn't get it. And he shared a little bit about his personal situation. He was fortunate enough to be able to, during the worst of the lockdown, to move to his family's second home in the country. And so there was less of the freneticism and the terror right then of a metropolitan area like New York City, which was going through the worst of the worst. But he made the observation, as we were talking, that he was noticing that he was less, even though he was out close by the beach and the ocean, he was less inclined to take his kids out, to go out, to travel freely. And it was just sort of an observation. So I asked him a little bit about his past history. It turned out that 15 years ago, he was a man in his mid-30s. He had several panic attacks, and they were untreated, and they disappeared on their own. He was fortunate, but they had, you know, he would mention it as part of his medical history when he went into to consult with a physician, but he didn't see it as, he just mentioned it in passing. And as he tried to pass by that, I asked him a little bit more about those panic attacks. And he gradually was able to express, with a certain degree of reticence and I fear embarrassment, that he hadn't cured this. He was kind of a cool macho guy, that he was worried about the recurrence of panic attacks. And his way of dealing with that was to avoid and restrict his usual activities. And he was avoiding to the point where, had there not been some discussion and awareness, he was practically becoming phobic. And that's a minor example about sort of pausing to take the time to think about the entire environment. So his external environment was fabulous. He was, you know, steps away from the Atlantic Ocean. And so he shouldn't have experiencing. So we talked about this from a kind of epigenetic perspective. If he had been my patient, as I got to know him, as I got to know his children and his partner, I would have looked at family dynamics, family health, the likelihood that some of his genetic predisposition had been inherited, but by the possibility that some of these genes that make one vulnerable to panic, anxiety, depression, which are all related to panic disorder, might be inherited by his genes. I would have had conversations with him about the advisability, about the meaning of whole genome sequencing, which is looking at the entirety of your genetics, all of the DNA related to all of your genes. I would have spoken to him thinking about tomorrow and the future, about recent information that suggests that stem cells, which are cells with the potential to develop into any or every other kind of cell, which we can now initiate ourselves, or initiate the development of new stem cells from a little pop of a little skin pop. So we can take our skin cells, transform them into stem cells, and as appropriate, transform them at some other point, were it necessary, into muscle cells or brain cells, et cetera, et cetera. There is data that suggests there may be great value to banking stem cells, understanding how the science is racing ahead. Your point earlier about, well, is CRISPR the definitive technology for changing genes? Absolutely. Another technology is stem cell biology. And it turns out that stem cells age too. So taking your children's stem cells when they're 11 or 13 is probably thinking about the future, probably a wise thing to do, rather than waiting until they're 40 or 50 or 60 years of age. So in terms of the work that I do, it's a kind of dynamic between the present, what we need to take care of right now, thinking about the future, planning for the future, recognizing that, you know, we can't fully plan appropriately, but you know what should be in the toolkit, and keeping abreast of the science, as Simon said, what's real, what's solid, what can be implemented in a general way, where is it headed, and bringing that knowledge, keeping it at the forefront of the family so that they can prepare themselves for the best versions of themselves. That was a little bit wordy, Louise.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, Ronnie. Thank you so much. I mean, it's really interesting. You know, my mind is also moving beyond family into executive leadership teams, boards, with businesses, and ensuring that that organizations, you know, we're either talking about managing risk, aren't we? Whether it's a family or perhaps C-suite or the board of an organization, critical people. And, you know, the key thing here, I guess, is that bridge for me that makes the most sense between the science and, as you say very sensibly, what is available to us today, preparing for what might come in the future, but not necessarily acting on it, because
yes.
There is another very big question around all of this, and that is the ethics. And I know that we've spoken a lot around the ethics, because there isn't that science and technology can't or won't be able to do moving forward. The question is, should we do it? So having that agency over how our data is dealt with, what decisions we might make in the future, but still having that almost that insurance policy so that you are prepared for the future, and you're prepared for your family's future, or the collection of key people in your organization that can affect things one way or another. That is absolutely front of mind, I think, for a lot of people. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, there are certainly... Yeah,
Go
there are certainly economic arguments for enhancing human capital as well. Ronnie, do you want to say a little bit more?
I was just going to share with Louise one of our favorite expressions. I think we authored it. Genetics is not a solo sport. So one's genes affect one's family, one's friends, one's business. And actually, I'd love to hear more from you, Louise, about your thoughts about the adoption of some of this perspective in the corporate setting. Simon and I talk about this approach in terms of the family as a means to enhance health. You mentioned, Louise, to mitigate risk and to ensure an optimal, enduring family legacy of the kind of family each family uniquely aspires to, and the ethical considerations, what is right for one set of individuals is not for another, and so these become very personal decisions, but these are conversations that are critical. But again, given your experience in the corporate world, how do you see some of this science and knowledge playing out?
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic, Ronnie. It's something that I think about a lot. And I think this idea of agency, when we look at trends, or what I like to think of as mega trends, things that arrive and, they have longevity and they stay with us over time. One of those is having agency over our health and well-being. And so at what point does agency over one's own health and well-being and the responsibility to do that impact a leadership team and organization? And I would say every single minute of every day of every year, right? So, where does the responsibility of the organization start, and where does the individual responsibility start? So I guess if we are looking at lowering risk or keeping an eye on risk, and we're looking at key people in our organization, what we probably want to do is give those people further agency into being able to manage their health to an optimum level. And I think that there's a balance. I think organizations would need to work out, and have these kind of frank, straight up conversations now that we have some science to support the age-old wisdoms around optimal health, about how they go about handling it. Because we don't need to just keep saying to people, okay, well, here's a great, gym membership wherever you want to join, and here's, we insure your life, and we make sure that you get to work safely, and all the things that we normally throw at executives. And we make sure that, you have your annual checkups and that you're in optimum physical health. But what we're understanding today, and certainly I understand so much better from this conversation and the others that we've had, is that it's not just about physical health, it's about mental health. It's about our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And of course, our behaviors are always as a result of our thoughts and our feelings. So they are the expression of those inner workings. So personally, I think that it should be a collaborative conversation that boards, that C-suite have, in terms of how they're going to go about managing their optimum health and giving their executives the tools to be able to do that. And the other one, the knock-on effect of mental health within organizations, within the culture of an organization, creating healthy ecosystems, environments. If we don't create that psychological safety and trust within organizations, it's pretty difficult to achieve the business outcomes that we're looking for. So for me, it's very systemic. It all filters all the way through. And I really think that organizations should be, and probably, are in many situations, but perhaps we just don't hear about it enough.
You see some examples creeping through. You look at a lot of these biophilic design buildings. I know Amazon just released renderings of their second headquarters in Virginia, which is very much grounded in biophilic design principles, and that's the idea of integrating nature into your surrounding environment. So already there you can see them starting to think about the importance and the role of nature in nourishing the employees that show up to work every day, and knowing that healthy employees deliver better results, and it's better for the company in the long term, and it's better for the employees. It attracts top talent. There are a lot of reasons to do it.
Yeah, not only long term but short term. And I think our sense of time has been altered significantly over the last year. Fantastic. So Ronnie, Simon, what I will do is post links in terms of how people can get hold of you and initiate a conversation around their own thinking around, whether it's from a family perspective or an executive team. And I'll make sure all of that data is in the links. Is there anything that I've missed? I mean, is there anything that you'd like to add to this conversation? That I know that there is one thing I wanted to ask you about, last but not least, and that is your Harvard case study, which is about to be published or has just been published. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Has just been published. And what's wonderful about the Harvard case method is that what it does is present, it's like a snapshot of a period in time. And it's a representation of an environment, a critical point of tension, of a choice facing typically a business. And it's really the Socratic method. And what the students do is they take this period in time and they consider the choices they would make. And we were honored to co-author a case study that involved an Israeli family, a wealthy family, with an extremely rare, heritable genetic disorder, one of those disorders that you can't wish away or will away by virtue of epigenetic behavior that we know about today. And if you are a carrier of the gene responsible for this disorder, the disease is Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome. If one is a carrier and the gene expresses itself, the fatality is 100%, and the process is a horrific neurodegenerative brain syndrome, and death occurs relatively rapidly and badly. And in this family, the protagonist learned that she carried the gene when she was pregnant at the age of 35, and it was kind of normal prenatal testing, and she had to make a decision. So she learned that she had the gene. She learned that her fetus had the gene, and she had to make a decision. So if she has the gene and it expresses oneself, she dies a terrible death. She thought about her life. She thought about all of its blessings. She decided to commit herself to take a very activist approach in looking for the cures for this disease and even potentially the epigenetic interventions which might thwart the disease. She decided to have her child. It turns out that her extensive family in Israel, there are over 150 individuals who each have a 50% likelihood of having the gene. So there are 150 relatives who, by virtue of understanding the family tree, have a 50% likelihood that they are carrying the disease. And the tension point that the case depicted was, should there be the development of a family genomics charter to assist the family in making decisions about would they be tested, would they not? If they were, would the results be private or available to others in the family? What were the implications? Again, this was a very wealthy family for the business, for succession. Could testing be required if one wanted to assume a high position in C-suite? Would one be eliminated if one had the gene? So all sorts of questions. And interestingly, this was the first time at Harvard in the history of the business school that the executive education program for family offices was held on Zoom. They had representatives from 6 continents. They didn't do such a terrific job advertising, apparently, in Antarctica because we had no representation there. So this is a wonderful global audience of family members, family office executives. And the discussion was really rich and exciting.
And it's a great example of, Louise, you mentioned ethics. This is a great example of having ethical discussions up front. So putting into practice the idea that ethics should be a forethought, not an afterthought. And it really was very well received, and people were engaged with it and continue to engage with it. You know, these are not questions that can be answered with a yes or a no. So they really do require a certain facilitation in the consideration of them.
And we look forward to facilitating again, likely via Zoom in April. I would just say another, as we wrap this up, another thing Simon and I chant with every thought, with every emotion, with every experience, we act as the epigenetic engineers of our cells, our bodies, and our lives.
Yeah, and that is such a profound thought. So it's so hopeful in terms of being able to actually do something and have that agency of the expression of our lives. And at the same time, of course, we need to take responsibility for self. So as ever, it's a double-edged, it's not a dilemma, it's not a sword, but a quandary, perhaps. And personally, I would far rather take responsibility and have some agency over that in the way that you've discussed. Thank you so much for your time, Simon, Ronnie. It's been really enlightening, and I think personally, I'm just left with this wonderful feeling of hope and the fact that, none of us are predestined to live our lives out in a certain way. There are some things that we have huge reluctant to use the word control, but agency, I guess, is the best way of describing it, over. And that responsibility is ours. And with the way that science is moving today, we now have things available to us, and people like you who are able to provide that interpretation and the ethics beforehand, as you said, Simon, rather than it being something that we think about post-event. So incredibly hopeful and encouraging. Thank you both so much.
And Louise, as always, your generosity, your wisdom, thank you. Thank you.